This is Gary DeMar of American Vision's Vantage Point, and in this series we are discussing the topic of economics based upon Wayne Grudem's book, Politics According to the Bible. This is part one of that series with Dr. Gary North.
Vantage Point is brought to you by American Vision. For more information on today's show, check out How to Argue with a Liberal and Win. You will find it at americanvision.com.
Welcome to today's Vantage Point, and I have with me Dr. Gary North, and we're going to talk about Wayne Grudem's new book, Politics According to the Bible. It's published by Zondervan, and as you can see, it's a thick, hefty book and deals with the whole spectrum of political issues according to the Bible. In an earlier show, we talked a little bit about ethics and the Old Testament and its relationship to the New Testament regarding politics. But there's a large section in Grudem's book on economics, and I can't think of anyone better to talk on that subject than Dr. Gary North. Gary North has written the most extensive commentary on the Bible as it relates to economics, going from Genesis to Revelation. We'll talk a little bit about that. My first introduction to economics from a Christian perspective was a lecture that Dr. North gave at Reformed Theological Seminary. Gary, that was when I think you debated Richard Mao. Was that 1978?
I don't know.
I think it was a little later than that because I was married at the time, so it had to be between 77 and 79 when I graduated.
A while back.
And your exposition on Isaiah regarding inflation, which is also a chapter in your book, An Introduction to Christian Economics. And as a student at Reformed Theological Seminary, we were all taught about Christian worldview, how the Bible applied to every area of life. And I can remember after your talk how some of the professors were a little put out by your talk about how, you could actually go to the Bible and deal with economics. But my wife and I Carol always told me that when she had her economics courses in college that they were so boring. It was a bunch of graphs and so forth. And that book, An Introduction to Christian Economics, was actually a breath of fresh air, and that it helped her understand economics from a biblical perspective. So I'm thankful that Wayne Grudem has taken on the topic of politics and has a section here on economics. Give us some idea of what Grudem gets right and what he gets wrong and what's missing.
Well, in the section on economics, and it's a rather extensive section, he covers some of the important issues of the modern world, certainly modern American economy. He goes into the healthcare issue. He talks about Social Security. He talks about money and the threat of inflation. He talks about other interventions into the economy in the area of poverty, wealth redistribution. And his basic position, to the extent that he develops it, is that we have too much intervention in the economy by the federal government. The federal government is much too large. We should pare back on the spending. We should cut back on the amount of regulation that the federal government is involved in. The strategy that he uses.
And those are all good things.
Oh yeah, these are certainly. It's if you stick your finger in a hornet's nest, don't punch it again, and certainly that's good advice. The question is, why did the hornet's nest come into existence? Why do we have this hornet's nest problem? We did not have this problem in the history of the world until after World War I. Going back as far as history goes, we do not have any records of any society, with the exception of ancient Egypt, that had this degree of control. There were other empires that it seemed comparable, but it really wasn't in terms of the amount of money that was spent. The Chinese Empire 1,000 years ago was extensive, but it wasn't anything like the modern economy with the degree of control. So you have to go back to ancient Egypt to see anything like what the modern world is. So the question is, why did this happen? He doesn't really talk about this. He mentions Karl Marx, and it's legitimate to talk about Marx, but really Marx did not become a phenomenon until Lenin. Lenin retroactively made Marx. There was a Marxian movement in Europe, but you never had the extensive commitment to Marxism that you had in 1917 in the Soviet Union and then thereafter. The modern world has bought into the welfare state. And the government keeps getting bigger because people have already made a kind of philosophical commitment or moral commitment to the legitimacy of the welfare state. And that's the underlying problem. We can argue about how big it ought to be, but the reality is it never gets smaller. It's a ratchet effect. You ratchet up the spending, it never gets cut back. You start a government program, it's never cut out.
And you've used the analogy of kicking the can, that once these programs get in, everybody knows that this is a problem. What they do is they kick the can down to the next 2 years of the election, and hopefully they'll be out of office before it all comes collapsing down on them.
That is basically the strategy all over the world that is being used. So on the one hand, you have this constant growth of government and government intervention. You also have, of course, you have economic growth. And so fortunately, and this is a good thing, and he doesn't talk about it, is that the amount of federal spending in relationship to total production, GDP, to whatever extent you want to go along with that, it never really exceeds about 25%. Now that's a lot, but it never goes over that. Even in World War II, it didn't go over that. So there is kind of a limit of about 25% of the national economy is tied to government. Now it's really higher than that because they count government spending as productive. But there is a kind of cap on the thing that has kept us from going in the direction of Europe, which is much further down the road than we are in terms of government control over the economy. So we're not in the shape that Asia is, Europe is. We're worse off than Asia is. So it's kind of we're kind of in the middle.
But this all is starting to accelerate, though.
In one sense, it is now. If we say yes, it's accelerating. The question is, will the public ever accept the increased level of taxation that is required to pay for what is accelerating? My belief is it will not. I think the Tea Party movement now is an indication that there is, once again, this cap of about 25% of federal spending. You go over that cap, you'll get political reaction in the United States. Nobody could overcome this. Roosevelt couldn't overcome it. None of the people we regard as political liberals could ever overcome that cap. We're now at that point again, and we are getting real resistance. Now, the problem is the programs aren't being cut back. So then what happens? If the public says we're not going to pay for this, and the programs keep accelerating, then one of two things are going to happen. You're going to have to cut the growth of the programs, which is proven politically impossible, or you're going to have to inflate. And you're really going to have to inflate to pay for this thing. Because if you, unless the Chinese just want to buy our bonds forever, which I think is unlikely, we will have to inflate. But somebody's got to pay for it if the taxpayer doesn't pay for it.
And of course, we've had this. I mean, what's interesting in all this is that Jimmy Carter is back in the news, and they're trying to. He's trying to justify his administration. But we think of what interest rates are today. I mean, they're down in the. And I just applied for a home equity line of credit for 2.99%. Mortgages are under 4%. Yes. And yet during Jimmy Carter's administration, mortgage rates were what, 14 and 15%?
Yes, that's right.
And, and inflation was
it was a double digit.
Yeah, double digits. And so we are headed. We're headed in that same direction. It seems to be the only option they've got.
Well, that is the only option they've got, and I think they know that, and they're just biding their time as best they can until they finally have to tell the Federal Reserve or ask the Federal Reserve or beg the Federal Reserve to buy the bonds, to buy more of this debt that the federal government is cranking out. So that's the problem. The problem is the deficit today. The level of spending is growing. The level of taxation is not growing. And there is a tax revolt movement beginning, and so politically it's unlikely that there are going to be any new major spending programs. So that leaves what? Either they're going to borrow it out of the private markets, in which case it won't go for funding private enterprise, or else they're going to inflate. And we don't know which way it's going. We have Japan as a model, which has been more don't have the growth but don't inflate. And if we go at that model, then unemployment's going to stay high. There's not going to be economic growth. You're going to be in this permanent contracting economy. We don't want that politically. We want economic growth. But on the other hand, if we don't cut the spending, if we don't cut the programs, we're not going to be able to restart the economy.
So Grudem does, I mean, he understands the problem.
Yes, he does.
And he presents the problem, which has been a pretty traditional way to deal with things in Austrian conservative economic policies. What is it that he's missing in his issue related to economics?
Well, the first thing he's missing is any developed exegesis of the passages. He quotes some Bible verses, and the Bible verses are good verses, and they are relevant to the issues that he raises. He develops no exegesis around them. An example would be he talks about the passage in 1 Samuel 8 where Samuel warns the people, if you get a king, he's going to take 10% of your income. And they're not fazed. They want the king. And God then, which he doesn't quote, says, they're not revolting against you, they are revolting against me. So the perception was that a society that would have the central government collect 10% of people's productivity in the Old Testament was considered a tyranny and was supposed to scare the people from accepting a king. But it didn't scare them, and it hasn't scared them today. And so we live in a society in which it's 25%. It's 2.5 times, approximately, what the limit of tyranny was as defined by Samuel. And the public can't tell the difference. So you would think Grudem would say, all right, what we've got to do is cut federal spending and federal taxation to less than 10%, because we've got to get back to a society which does not qualify as Old Testament tyranny. Of course, he doesn't do this. There's no number, there's no application, there's no section on here's what we cut, or is it across the board cut? We've got to, in the name of Christ or in the name of the Bible, go to a society in which the federal government does not take as much as 10% of our productivity. There's no recommendation, there's no policy. So if the policy prescription that follows from the text is ignored, and there's no exegesis of the way in which the text ought to be applied, then why do you quote the text? What is the point of quoting the text if, in fact, you have no call to action to implement the text?
Well, we've run out of time for this edition of Vantage Point. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about Wayne Grudem's book, Politics According to the Bible, with Dr. Gary North.
For more information on today's show, check out How to Argue with a Liberal and Win, edited by Joel McDermott. Countering dozens of liberal arguments with logic and tact, How to Argue with a Liberal and Win is a crash course on defending the principles of liberty from her enemies, and gives realistic, educated answers to some of the most persistent cliches of socialism. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.